I'd like you to close your eyes for just a minute and pretend that Scott Morrison or Anthony Albanese have a new policy that I'd like to sell you on. This policy is a new tax that, where applied, will be the second largest expenditure in a family's budget. It'll only apply to parents with young children. It'll be a flat rate, so it will, yes, hit lower incomes hardest. And here's the real kicker. It will only apply to families with young children when they attempt to re-engage in the workforce. Now, it sounds absurd, doesn't it? No politician under the sun from any party would propose such an unpopular, economically harmful tax. And yet, that's the situation that exists for hundreds of thousands of Australians who have children in childcare right now. Families have to pay currently anywhere from $70 to $150 per child per day, just so that they can re-engage with the workforce. And for many of these families, the numbers just don't add up. The situation is what you get when you take an industrial system designed for male breadwinners and adapt it ad hoc over time to compensate for female participation. Now, to be fair, successive governments have tried to civilise this scheme. The childcare rebate, for instance, is targeted for those working families who need the most help. But what I'm saying is this is not enough. Let's stop trying to put lipstick on this pig. It's time to redesign this system to take account of what society currently looks like, where families are encouraged, not penalised, to get back into the workforce. In short, it's time for universal childcare. Now, for hundreds of years, governments have built infrastructure to help the free flow of commerce, roads and bridges, dams and sewers. Well, similarly, childcare is infrastructure for families. Australia has one of the lowest female participation rates in the OECD. This is not just bad for the individuals, it's bad for the economy. The government is crying out for additional labour force participation right now, and our economy needs desperately to climb out of this recession. And the research shows that children who attend childcare are less likely to develop costly problems later in life, especially if they're from disadvantaged backgrounds. So disincentivising parents and robbing their children of an early education is an inefficiency that the system can no longer afford. So, Catherine, do you agree that universal childcare should be a permanent government policy?
Well, no, I don't. And I say that based on two things, Sam. I think your aspiration and your description of the labour market is fairly accurate, but there still remains, and parents of both male and female parents I know who actually value the parenting time of those early years and rotate. I especially saw that in my Defence Force service, where people would rotate postings to spend quality time with the kids rather than subcontracting it out. Now, I know that's an idealised world and it was a supportive work environment. Not every employer is that good. But I also know there are plenty of people who don't regard the work-life balance thing as being solved automatically by subcontracting, the really formative years of their child's life out to others. And I think it's a very personal matter. So universalising it does go a little bit against my grain, I've got to say. But your points are well made in terms of mobilising as many people who want to work as can. The only other caveat, and I'll give someone else a go on this, is that yet another tax, when we're bottoming in the economic conditions in which we find ourselves. We've talked about expanding the social housing stock pool tonight. We've talked about defence in other weeks. What are we going to do? Are we going to embrace new monetary theory? Because if we go with everything we've talked about tonight, we're looking at a Scandinavian welfare state, and that actually does not sit well with my Australian instinct. That's just an instinctive social conservative response to your proposition.
Sure, okay. Tanvir, what do you think? Surely you're going to endorse Scott Morrison's proposal from a few months ago for universal childcare.
Look, a few things, Sam. One, logistically, it'd actually be extremely difficult. Like you just wouldn't have the resources to cope with the increase in demand in terms of staff and the sheer number of resources in childcare centres. So it would be a very difficult one just to apply, even if it were possible and well supported. Now, one tension, I mean, someone with young kids, admittedly they're a little bit older, but we were certainly in the thick of childcare, not too long ago. And I was on local government too when childcare was an issue. There's a real tension between quality and affordability. We've actually spent something like almost $8.5–9 billion on childcare. Yet affordability, it's only got worse. So the government's spending more, and we're all individually spending more. There's this interesting tension between quality, and you made reference to it by calling it childhood education. And it is interesting. There's no question early childhood, attention, and some of that would be education, but much of education early is really about play and allowing them to play freely and interact freely. So what often attention you're getting, Sam, is there's this focus on quality, which is actually driving up prices. And I'll give you an example. When I was in local government, what happened was suddenly there were new things about you have to have a higher level of English and you need to do this diploma. You know what that did, perversely? It got rid of all these immigrant women that had been doing a perfectly competent job looking after kids for sometimes decades, and they could no longer do it, and suddenly you had less labour supply as well. What parents really want is flexibility. I'd love some more ideas about, having an option to go, OK, we get a chunk of money and I can use that to a nanny. I mean, the best childcare is from relatives and grandparents, above all else. And, they don't need a master's degree to do that,
Tell you the other thing that needs to happen first is everyone's got to go back to work and get out of their house arrest where they're actually schooling their own kids at home at the moment anyway in some states, and that's a more pressing problem, isn't it?
But look, your broad principle is correct, Sam, in the reality is there are certainly, especially the second income earner, especially in the lower levels of the labour market, they're very sensitive to childcare prices and funding. And the second earner, often the mother or the woman in the household, is far more likely to cut back hours if childcare costs go up. So I think that's...
Well, that's right. I mean, for most or not most, but for many families below the median income of $70,000, if you're in an area that the only childcare services you have are $150 per day, it just doesn't make sense
absolutely. No, I think
to go to work.
I think we have to do better there. But I think one of the things we have to be wary of is keep pushing this quality thing. I mean, it sounds good. It sounds good, but we actually get a perverse outcome in the sector.
Michael, what do you think?
Well, I think to a certain extent, Sam, we're looking at this the wrong way around. I think the problem with childcare isn't necessarily who pays for it, although that is an issue. I don't deny that. It's the cost up front. The issue of the cost is the problem. I mean, I've had people call me on air and tell me, and they're quite right, that it can cost as much to send a 4-year-old or a 3-year-old to childcare, doing what they do, finger painting, the rest of it, as it can to send a 15-year-old to a top Protestant private school in Sydney or Melbourne.
Absolutely true.
Now, that's just ridiculous, and yet it's the fact. And so what we've got to look at here, before we start saying, well, should parents pay more or should the taxpayer, which really is a collective noun for parents, pay more, what we should be saying is, why is childcare so expensive? And Tanvir quite rightly touched on some of that just a second ago. How do we get those costs down and then look at how we pay for it? Because at the end of the day, whether it's you and your wife or my wife and I or somebody else out there who pays or the taxpayer who pays, if we're being ripped off, that's the problem. And I think that's where we're at. And now, I don't have a magic solution, but I think Tanvir is quite right. And a lot of this started with the Gillard government, I believe. A lot of this quality metrics, some of which is very worthwhile, but it always comes at a price. And we do have to weigh up on a cost-benefit analysis, I think, whether it is worth it.
No, it's a very good point. And when you look at the early childhood education sector, it's the only part of the education journey, if you like, from babies all the way through to PhDs. It's the only part that doesn't have a large government presence in the market depressing prices. So, you can... have a primary school, they can only charge so much because down the road there's the free government option.
That's right.
The same for TAFE with private colleges. So you can have the public and private systems working side by side as long as the government system is in there pulling prices down. I dare say, I don't want to quiz you on the numbers, Tanvir, but when you're on council, most councils, they actually run their centres at a profit. not a big profit, but at a profit, and they use those numbers to cross-subsidise their other services. And they're able to do this because they're just charging what the market charges. They don't want to undercut what the private centre down the road is. But you're absolutely right. In that $140, $150 that a lot of families out there paying, there is a huge amount of fat in there that can be cut off.
I agree with you. And from memory from council, you are right, some of it gets cross-subsidised, but they often have a mix. I noticed some they run as a not-for-profit, other they run for profit, so it does seem to vary. But I think this one, while there's an element of ideology, and I agree with Catherine in the sense that I don't instinctively and philosophically, I don't believe in that universal component, but I think your core points and what both sides are trying to do the same thing, which is make it easy for parents to be flexible and allow them to go to work and do more hours if they want to.